On the line now is the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Richard Marles. Good morning.
Good morning, Mitchell. How are you?
Good, thank you. What's it like in federal politics at the moment? I think that the opposition, and this is both state and federal, is starting to scrutinise the government a bit more heavily, and of course some big revelations about accounting figures over the weekend.
Yeah, I think there is a bit of a returning to normality, but we're still coming out of a crisis, and I think there is obviously in the midst of a crisis, it's really important that there is a focus on working together and making sure that we deal with the situation. And so the appetite for kind of scrutiny is perhaps not as much as there would be normally, but scrutiny is critically important to good government. So that's happening, and we've seen that over the weekend where this government managed to come up with a $60 billion blunder in its figures in relation to JobKeeper, which is the single biggest accounting error that a Commonwealth government has had since Federation. I mean, it's a prodigious amount of money. It's in fact the entire amount of the global financial crisis stimulus that occurred under the Rudd-Gillard government. And what's astounding to think about is that, just a week ago, they were imagining that was all going to be spent, and as it turns out, on absolutely nothing.
I saw a tweet from Kevin Rudd over the weekend, and he talked about how the Murdoch media went to town while he was in power, while Julia Gillard was in power, on some of the accounting issues, but he says that they've gone quiet this time around. Do you think that he's right to point out what he says is the bias of the Murdoch media?
Well, look, I think what is really plain here is that this is an error of prodigious proportions. And the issue here, irrespective of what side of the ledger that error lies, is that it points to the fact that the government was out of touch with reality by that amount. And a whole lot of things flow from that, forecasting, people's planning, how schemes are designed. To be that far off the mark means you're not in touch with properly managing this country. And actually what we need at the moment is a government which is in touch with its hands on the wheel, because this is an enormous crisis that we're facing.
So if Labor were in power, how would you design the JobKeeper or job seeker payments? Is it about including sectors like the tertiary education sector, for example?
Well, I think there needs to be a good look at that, and I think at the very least what we now need to know, given what the reality of the figures is a costing in terms of how much it would cost to include universities or the foreign-owned companies or the government foreign-owned companies. There are people who have certainly missed out on JobKeeper, and one of the problems with that is that those people end up being on JobSeeker, so one way or another the government pays, but the connection between those people and their employer is lost if they are on JobSeeker. And the point of a wage subsidy, which is what we were arguing from day one, is that given that the government is going to be paying one way or another, at least this way you keep people in connection with their employer and their employment, and there is a much better chance that they will be able to continue their employment when we get to the other side of this. And I think that's the issue here. And we look at Deakin right now; it's on the front page of the Addy this morning that they're forecasting significant job losses, given what's happening with Deakin, and so the question has to be asked.
And in terms of the sort of phasing out of the scheme in September or whenever it is it good news that perhaps it's come in a bit cheaper than what was anticipated? Does that mean that we can look at things like extending the scheme further or even including more sectors as we've discussed?
Well, I don't think anything is good news. In relation to all of this. And to be fair, we're talking about a response to a global pandemic, which is obviously not the government's fault. But how this has been managed and what the situation that we find ourselves in at the end of the day is going to put an incredible amount of debt onto the bottom line of our nation, which is going to be being paid off for decades to come. So I think, we just need to remember that. In terms of how this should be removed, but what's the way that the relief comes off and we get back to a more normal environment, I think it is important that that's phased. If there is a kind of a drop dead date where it all happens on one day in September, that has the very real risk of giving rise to another economic shock, which could be very counterproductive for the economy. So I think whether this accounting error had been there or not, the government was going to have to think about ways in which it phased out the relief that is currently in place, because I don't think it was ever feasible to do it on a single day, which is what they were initially forecasting. But still, it's not clear from where the government's at exactly how that is going to work, and I think the sooner we hear that from the government, the better.
And in terms of the broader restrictions, I think one thing we've learnt from this is how much power the states have, which has clearly always been there, but each state is doing things very differently.
That's right. I think it would be better, I think, if there were greater national coordination around this. Scott Morrison touts his sort of credentials in terms of cooperative federalism with the National Cabinet, which really amounts to not much more than renaming the Council of Australian Governments. But we've got a situation now where we've got state governments fighting each other and the Commonwealth participating in that fight around whether borders of states should be closed or not. What would be much better is if there was leadership on the part of our national government of the states, so that everyone was moving in the same direction around these questions, and how physical distancing measures were initially being put in place and now how they're being relaxed. There is going to be differences around the country, but that can be as much within a state as it is between the states. I think what's important is that there is national leadership around what principles are being applied wherever we are in Australia in terms of how we get through the physical distancing.
I was interested to see some people looking to challenge the closing of state borders. We can't preempt any decisions by the High Court, but it's an interesting test, because I always thought the point of the Constitution was to open up the trade between states, and I didn't know until this crisis that the states actually had the power to close state borders.
Well, I think what powers the states do or don't have in relation to that is going to be answered by the High Court, I think. And you're right, as a student of history, it was always my understanding that the Federation, Australia, came to pass because of a desire to open up state borders and have freedom of trade and commerce across the continent. So we'll find out what the answer to that is. But I think the point here is it would have been far better if, rather than we had lawsuits in the High Court, that we're actually having cooperation between the governments of Australia around these questions. And inevitably that requires national leadership. I mean, if you think about what's going on with the dispute over the border south of the Gold Coast between Queensland and New South Wales, I mean, it obviously needs to be the federal government which leads a path through that. It's not a great situation that we see a whole lot of governments fighting each other and these matters ultimately being determined in the courts.
What do you think of the risk of a second spike? The view of a lot of people in the community that I've been talking to, just regular people, seems to be get out there and enjoy the easing of restrictions now, because there probably will be a second spike and we'll be back into lockdown again.
Well, I certainly hope not. And I think we need to be avoiding that. And it's why we need to be proceeding with caution here. Look, Australians have done a superb job in the last couple of months in enduring physical distancing in a way which has meant that the virus has been brought under control, and with far fewer health impacts than I think any of us imagined. And we've managed to avoid the kinds of appalling scenes that we've seen on our TVs from Western Europe and North America. And that's very much an achievement of the Australian people. The economic impact of that, though, has been enormous. I mean, we are seeing unemployment now at a rate which we haven't seen since the Great Depression. And it is obviously important that we try and move to a point of economic normality and we get through this as quickly as possible. But if what we find ourselves in is a cycle of kind of opening too quickly, second wave, and then we have to lock down again, that's going to be disastrous for the economy. I mean, the long-term economic impact of that will be appalling. And so it's why it's much better, I think, that we get it right in the first instance and that we take our time to make sure that we get each of the physical distancing measures right in terms of easing them, so that we only ever have to go through this process once. And it's why I certainly understand governments being cautious about how they ease physical distancing. But it's, and obviously we all want to see that. We want to see it happen as quickly as possible, but I think governments are right to be cautious about it because the economic consequence of a second wave would be profound. So we've really got to do everything we can to avoid it.
And one of the big things in all of this is Australia's relationship with China, and a few federal MPs have expressed their thoughts, and ranging in severity from Australia should diversify its economy to some sort of independent inquiry. But this has really come to the fore with the comments of Mike Pompeo over the weekend, particularly around Victoria's relationship with China through the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a big question, but what do you think will come of our relationship with China as a result of this?
The relationship with China is complex. It's difficult. It's as complex a bilateral relationship as we have with any country in the world, but it is critically important, and that is to state the obvious. I mean, there are thousands of jobs within our region in Geelong which are dependent upon trade with China. And, I've had constituents ring me about their anxiety in relation to what this will mean for their business and those who work in the business, because their businesses involve a trade with China. And so it's a relationship that needs to be handled with enormous care, with intelligence, and with respect and with prudency. Now, in the midst of all of that, it is complex because there are occasions where we need to make sure that as a country we have the courage to speak out in respect of Australia's national interest when that differs from Chinese action. We've seen that over the last few years in relation to the South China Sea, and it is true that we must see a proper investigation and inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus. I think that's less about seeking to blame as it is to properly understand how this virus transferred into humanity and what we can learn about it so that we can be better prepared or perhaps be able to stop such things occurring in the future. But, this has affected the globe, and it's really, really important that we understand this as deeply as we can. And you look at the Animal Health Laboratory in Geelong, we've got global experts in exactly this field of science who, I think could play a significant part in understanding this question, which is why, it's really important from a global perspective that occurs. Now, it does matter that we are able to voice that view and in the context of our relationship with China, but that only puts into stark relief the need for the relationship to be handled with enormous care so that we can have the room to say these things when we need to, but we can continue to engage given how important China is in relation to our trade. What has worried me, not just the last couple of weeks, but over the last few years, is that because this relationship has been deteriorating for the last few years, well before COVID struck, is that far too often what we see on the side of the government is the agenda being taken up by the kind of fringe dwellers of the government, rather than, the key ministers in the space. I mean, Marise Payne, you barely see. She doesn't feel that there is an obligation to talk to the Australian people about our foreign policy. I frankly think that's an outrage. The Prime Minister himself isn't particularly vocal about our relationship with China. And into the space, we see a whole lot of fringe dwellers walk in there on the government side, making all sorts of claims, which then end up putting a hue over the way the government acts and is perceived, and I think that's a problem. And so, we need to have greater leadership from our government in relation to what is a very complex relationship, and we need that. so that we can have our voice heard on difficult issues, but so that we can continue to engage and trade with China, knowing the important economic benefit and employment opportunities that come from that.
And finally, school's back this morning. Not all students, only those at the top end and the lower end in terms of the years, but at least we're starting to get schools back. And I believe you visited a local school just yesterday. What's the mood like there?
So I was out at St Thomas Aquinas in North Shore in North Lane yesterday, and I think they were pretty excited. I was speaking with Rod Sims, who's the principal, and asking him how he felt about it. I mean, they've obviously had an operation going over the last few weeks and last couple of months in terms of kids of essential workers. So it's not like the school has been closed, but there haven't been many kids there. But certainly he was looking forward to today with a much larger cohort of kids coming in the door. And, he said to me, it's time. And I've have three of my own kids at home who have been doing a great job, I might say, doing distance learning. One of them goes back today. Still got two at home, and they're probably a couple of weeks away, I think, before it looks like they're going back.
Yes.
But I know that my eldest daughter, who was getting into her uniform for the first time in a couple of months, really today, she was pretty excited about getting back to school as well. So it's a big day.
Good news. Thank you very much for being on the program. We'll catch up with you again next month.
It's a pleasure, Mitchell. Thank you.
Deputy Leader of the Opposition and Federal MP for Corio, Richard Marles.